This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. Disefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold and start rethinking faith today.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? You have made it to another Smarty Pants episode where I interview a professor or author or someone else that's super smart to get their insights into the world of spirituality and belief so that we can find the beliefs that work for us, the beliefs that help us be the best version of ourselves and find a purpose greater than ourselves. Today, I get to interview an actual heretic, Matthew Disefano. We're doing it live, so there's all kinds of fun interaction, but this is going to be so interesting. Matthew is the author of Heretic 2, and this is sort of, obviously, it's the sequel to Heretic. Matthew, I've just got to know, what? Look at it. It's right there. Right, can you tell me a little bit about, what got you? What's Heretic 1? What was there, and why?
Heretic 1. I better go grab it because it came out. And when you write, sometimes, as you know, you forget what you write about. But Heretic 1 was. Heretic 1 was basically, we have TikTok these days. Back when I was writing Heretic 1, we didn't have TikTok, but I was doing a lot of blogging on Pathos and things like that. And so, and I don't know, I'm getting some echo from you, just so you know. What I was running into when I would write, when I would suggest that maybe our theology that I grew up with was wrong, maybe evangelicalism missed the mark when it comes to a proper understanding of God, a robust understanding of God that's not so myopic and American-centered and white-centered and straight-centered. And so I commonly found, these days I say it's almost like there's Christian answers that are spit out by AI.
Right.
Where no matter what you're talking about, you'll get these stock answers about how Jesus is Lord and give your heart to God. And it was very well, what about this verse? Or, well, what about this concept? Or what? And there seemed to be 10 of them that stood out. So I wrote 10 essays essentially saying okay, well, yeah. Okay. What about hell?
Right.
What about it? Maybe it's not as determined to be eternal torment. What about Jesus? Is he really is he really someone that we are supposed to worship?
Right.
Did he ask us to worship him?
Yeah.
Is he? Because we kind of treat him just like a get out of hell free card. Also, right. We're very fixated in Christianity and in the West on the afterlife. Right. So I talk about that. And Heretic 2, is just 10 more things.
Yeah. It's
almost like you could put the books together and be okay, this would be my, as unsystematic as I am, my systematic theology, my 20 theses. I don't want to write 95.
That's right. So, I just to get right into it. So chapter 1 is following Jesus, the way of the Bodhisattva. I mess that up every time. How do you say the word bodhisattva?
Bodhisattva, yeah.
Bodhisattva.
The
I got it.
bodhisattva.
Okay, I mess that up every time I say it. So first off, what is the bodhisattva?
Well, I mean, they're just like in Christian theology, in Buddhism, there are many different thoughts of what different things are and what the Brahman is and the Atman. And the Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, the way I understand it, is the human, is the being who puts off their own desire for enlightenment for the sake of others.
Right.
So it's a very other-oriented, service-oriented approach to their faith. Faith is a weird word when describing Buddhism, but we could use it, I guess. Sure. And I see similar understandings of the concept of kenosis in Christian theology of Jesus emptying himself to live as, his favorite phrase was the Son of Man, not the Messiah, not God, not God's Son. But his favorite phrase was the Son of Man, like the servant of the true human, the servant of the human, the what Luther would probably call like a theology from below.
Right. So, so that's what the bodhisattva is, and what you talk about here is that like Jesus is coming, like it's this like way of being in the world, the compassion, the presence. So how do you match then the bodhisattva with the teachings of Jesus? Like, can you give us some specific examples of it so that we can, because I think for me, I like, obviously the book is called Heretic too. So like when I grew up in evangelical world, right, the idea of, sort of doing a mashup of two religions, I mean, that would get you thrown out right away. So
sure.
But can you put that together in sort of premise format? Like, what are the connections that you make in the book?
Yeah, I actually make the clarification that isn't really what I'm trying to do, and so I start out by saying like Jesus's context is very dissimilar than the Buddha. For sure. Jesus has a hyper political context in which his religion is living in an occupied land, right, by a Roman power. Jesus was dirt poor. Right. Buddha came from an aristocracy type family. Had a little more money, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. So I do make these are two different contexts, and I don't think the way I understand the Buddhist perspective would be different than the Western Christian, where it's like there's these theologies or these dogmas, and they do have that. But the understanding of Buddhism I'm talking about is more just a way of being in the world and moving and living and being in the world. So there are a lot of differences. The similarities I want to talk to was the service-oriented nature of these two. Well, I don't want to say people, Jesus and Buddha. I would say Jesus and Buddha are more archetypes for all of us. Like, right. I'm of the belief that when Jesus called us brothers and sisters, like, I mean, it comes down to logic for me. Like, if Jesus is God's son and he called us brother and sister, the conclusion should be fairly simple. That we're all God's children, right? That's how I would approach it. Like, so when I approach Jesus, it's a very human oriented one. Christians are going to bristle at that because they want to talk about the divinity of Jesus. Right. For me, though, again, it's Heretic, so it's a Heretic 2, so it's a book of heresy. I'm more interested in the human Jesus because it's not to say Jesus isn't God. I don't want to even, like, what would that even mean? Because what you say about God is going to be 40,000 denominations can't be wrong, right?
Right, for sure. Well, to just kind of, you talk about like doctrine and theology. You have one of the chapters really pushes hard against maybe one of the like deepest held pieces of doctrine, especially for people in the Reformed stream. You've got this chapter called License to Sin, where you talk specifically about original sin in this. I mean, it's really great. And I like you talk about the sort of development of this, right? So what's wrong with original sin?
I think it'd be shorter if I just said what's right with it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, so I other than the guilt and shame that, like, it's like talking about like intergenerational sins, like we pass on the sins of our fathers or something, and
Yeah.
it seems like there was a really strong pushback against that, especially in the New Testament. Like when the apostles asked Jesus who sinned, him or his family, it's like, no, that's not how it works.
Right.
I mean, I have a problem with Christian theology that goes back as far as Augustine, who hated Greek. Didn't speak it, didn't read it, did not like it. If we want to get down into like drill down into the differences between Latin and Greek, and I'm no scholar of either, but sometimes language doesn't have these one-to-one correspondences with words. So
sure.
if you say something in Greek and you say the equivalent, so-called, in Latin, that's not always an equivalent, because that's not how language develops. I don't see anything within Paul that talks about like sin as this damnable thing that gets passed on when you're born.
Right.
It seems that more he talks about it as like sin and death coming through Adam is more of a contagion, like a pandemic would be. Not that your parents were guilty and now you're guilty of eternal whatever. Like the presupposition of hell, I have a problem with too, that original sin leads us to.
Yeah.
And I do talk about hell in the book too. So, and going back to Augustine, like he brought a lot of his baggage with him to Christianity.
For sure. As we all do.
I mean, we all do. I'm just saying, like, it too often in Christian theology, we talk about it as if it's straight from the gospel, but really it's so heavily influenced by certain theologians, Augustine, Calvin, whatever your denomination is, whatever you emphasize. We often do that without knowing we're doing that.
Yeah. And the basic idea of original sin is like people are born sinful, right?
Yeah, wretched worms.
Yeah, wretched, right? Completely awful. Which for me, the thing that bothers me about it is, the first chapter of Genesis is a big deal for me. A lot of my entire take on faith and life is rooted there, and what we see there is that like the beginning, like we're image bearers of God. If anything, the core of us is not sinful, right?
Yeah.
You can't be an image bearer of God and the core of you be just totally wretched and depraved and unforgivable. But the thing that I'd be interested in hearing you talk about original sin is like, how do you think this sort of doctrine has shaped like modern Christian attitudes towards sin and grace?
I think it overemphasizes sin so much that we stop living. It's all about sin avoidance. Like it's
right.
There's such an emphasis on the fact that you're wretched and depraved, and we have this habit of going from one extreme to the other.
Yeah.
So in my theology, for instance, like I would definitely take sin seriously if I used that language.
Right.
I don't typically, as someone who is such a heretic that I'm probably a post-Christian, but using that language is fine. It's just to say we elevate grace that much more.
Right.
Like I don't see why we have to have these. Oh, so you don't believe in original sin, so therefore God doesn't care about sin. And we do this sort of like when we bowl, we hit the guardrails when we're learning how to bowl, or when we're driving, we overcorrect. Yeah. And we do that in the church. And so I think a more proper understanding like would be actually what Jewish people seem to believe. Like we have two yetzers, the impulse for good and the impulse for bad, and it's split right down the middle of us.
Yeah.
And I think that would be much, I think seems much more accurate. It also seems much more healthy. Like, no, I'm not a wretched worm.
Right.
I'm not a piece of garbage. I'm not. And like you said, how can we be image bearers of God and be totally wretched?
Right.
Like that to me is such a dubious interpretation of Isaiah. I don't know. I don't find it very compelling.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think if I'm remembering what you said right, it's kind of like you talk about God's forgiveness sort of preceding, right? Like going before all of this. I like that idea that the forgiveness is sort of like almost like canceling out the whole original sin thing, because it's bigger, it's more expansive, like original forgiveness almost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that seems to be the pattern in the New Testament where like it's the forgiveness that causes the repentance. Like the sinner gets forgiven and then said, go and sin no more. Now go repent of it. Go change your mind. Go change the way you think. It's not necessarily always the pattern. I think there are some instances where that's not the case.
Yeah.
But I think that we can't. I mean, we also have this propensity in the Christian church to like universalize certain passages,
Right.
and make it very much like, oh, it said it here, so that now we have to read everything in light of that.
Right.
So the overall trajectory seems to be like the forgiveness changes you so that you're more forgiving toward others. It's this mimetic thing that if we're to really follow Jesus, John's gospel emphasizes this a lot. If we follow Jesus, we follow in that, and he shows us and the way to do it. And incidentally, early Christians were called followers of the way. And incidentally, there's an atonement, the whole atonement theory. That's the moral influence. Like, I don't think it sums up all of the totality of atonement in Christian theology, but I think moral influence should be a part of it. Like, Jesus shows us how to be in the world, and he seems to be preemptively forgiving, and he seems to want us to follow in that.
And you say preemptively forgiving. What do you mean by that? Like, that's not a word that was used in my evangelical church growing up. That's not a term.
Yeah, it's more about like a posture of mercy, a posture of, and it doesn't mean we don't hold things accountable. Again, balance.
Sure.
We don't want to go back and forth and smack off each guardrail. But when he says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
He's removing the action from the intention. If they knew what they were doing, he's probably saying they wouldn't do this.
Right.
So there is a certain ignorance in our mob mentality. There's an ignorance in our politic. There's an ignorance in our human-to-human interaction, our psychology, the way we treat others, the way we marginalize others. And if we knew, as image bearers of God, if we truly knew what we were doing, we wouldn't be doing this. We wouldn't be treating each other like this.
Yeah.
I think that's his posture towards sinners more often than not. And then when he shows us that, he's like, don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Just there's this Saturday Night Live skit where he said, hey, it's like really simple. Like, find something that you're doing that is screwing up and then stop it. Like, don't do that thing. Then find something else that's wrong and stop it. Like, now, so you're talking about original sin earlier, and you said something about how the way that sort of original sin is set up, it leads you to hell. What do you mean by that? Because I actually want to like transition from here to your chapter on hell.
Well, I just mean it kind of like Augustine believed in hell so much that I think he calculated a percentage of people that weren't going to go there. It just seems like it's also built into the justification theory of Protestantism that an eternal God of wrath has to be assuaged by a perfect human.
Yeah.
And all of us are wretches, so that's why Jesus had to come and bear God's wrath. Because none of us could do that because we are born so guilty, damnable, we are what Augustine's phrase, I think, massa damnata. We are a damned mass of people.
Yeah. Right.
And only through, that's why Jesus had to be sacrificed, because Jesus
Right.
is perfect and he's not imputed with this original sin because he's God's only son. So that's how that whole justification theory works, because we start out with the presupposition that God is a God of wrath and demands retribution. Or in the case of hell, I call it super retribution, because finite sins are leading to infinite punishment.
Yeah.
And they'll say it's because it's against an infinite God.
Right. And so, okay, so then let's talk about hell, right? Because hell is an interesting concept, especially when you think of it as if eternal conscious punishment always happened. Because at the beginning of Christianity, right, you've got like a handful of people, right? You've got several thousand people, and you've got several thousand people that are talking about the grace of God. And so if eternal conscious punishment was the norm right from the beginning, it doesn't make any sense that if somebody has to personally accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, right? There's only 10,000, 20,000. So that means all of the other people in the world are going to experience eternal conscious punishment, right? It's going to experience what we talk of as hell, right? And so what I think is interesting is that the reality is like, that's not a concept that was there, right? Like that concept develops.
Well, and to go back further, Jesus would have to have almost invented it himself, because that is not a Jewish concept.
Nope.
Any understanding of post-mortem punishment came into Judaism, but there was even a finite period of time on that.
Right.
I think it's 12 to 18 months you would spend in Sheol for punishment. And then after that, it's like, well, they don't develop a doctrine like we have now. So Jesus would have literally had to invent it, and that he would have had to been the founder of because God makes no mention through the prophets, through the Torah, of any sort of eternal conscious torment for those who won't accept the Messiah. The Messiah was for Jews anyway. It wasn't,
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting to me is like when you look at Paul seems to actually be asserting annihilationism. Right. When you look at, he doesn't talk about any punishment for the wicked. He doesn't talk about any sort of eternity for the wicked. He talks about eternity for all the good people. And so you've either got Paul sort of believing that in universal salvation, or you've got him believing, which sort of was one of the accepted views at the time, that there was like, that the wicked just ceased to exist. That was their punishment.
I think you might actually possibly could have both. And I'd have to relook at the dates. But it seems that by the time we get to Romans, he's a universalist. He may not have started as that. We do get some mention in Thessalonians about destruction.
Right.
That could be the destruction he himself faced also. Right. It could be an annihilation of sorts. So I think, I think when we have, like, let's say, I've heard the term flat Bible, inerrant Bible, we don't allow individual writers to change and grow. I think it's pretty obvious that from Galatians to Romans, there's a shift in Paul in some way. Right. He seems explicitly universalist in Romans, and that's a whole different conversation, because I don't think people are reading Romans quite right. Right. But I don't know if he would have started as a universalist. But I mean, just think of our own stories. You have the Damascus Road. I'm not going to get into the literalism of that event. Right. The point of it would be that if you're going to have such a powerful shift in your theology and how you approach the world and who God is, it's going to take time for your theology to catch up. As those of us who have deconstructed or been on this journey of spiritual whatever, we know things take time to catch up. Right.
And so if you're, you sort of are asserting Paul really the Christian movement early on is universalist. How does that shift happen from early Christian universalism to this doctrine of eternal torment, right? Eternal conscious punishment.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's a lot of factors that go into it. There's different councils that I noticed, a big shift from like the earliest Apostles' Creed
Right.
into the Nicene Creed,
Right.
into later creeds that would condemn a type of universalism called Origenism, but it was
Right.
universalism was kind of guilty by association there in the 5th, 6th century.
Mm-hmm.
Now you get to like the Reformation. You have the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's like pages and pages long.
Right.
It seemed like we can't help ourselves but to add what you need to believe to be in.
Right.
I just can't help myself. It can't just be like, by the grace of God, we trust the faith of Jesus, and we're like, it can't just be like some simple, we got to, but no, hold on. People got to be punished. Oh, hold on. What about this? And hold on. The Bible has to be the inerrant word of God. Hold on.
Right.
We got to have some sort of atonement theory that's correct. And we just can't help ourselves but add rules and regulations all just on top of.
Right. And I think that
I think
you're noting I think you're noting like the creeds and the councils. It is interesting to me that a lot of this doesn't really come into the greater Christian discussion until Christianity gets a seat at the table in the sort of in the realm of the powerful, like when Christianity becomes part of the Roman government, right? And we see the emergence of Christendom. And at that point, really the idea, it's just mirroring the way the power is structured at that time in the political world.
Yeah, and when you have a consolidation of power, you go from Christianities to capital C Christianity, Christendom, like you just said. In the earliest church, it was Christianities. It was the Pauline communities. Yep. There was the John's communities, and they had their texts, and these groups had their texts, and there was a universalism of sorts, but there was a pluralistic approach to the faith, and then everything gets consolidated, and you get ideas like, well, hell then used to justify burning heretics at the stake because heretics murder the soul. We're only murdering the body.
Right.
And so I think when you do consolidate power, you can wield it quite well. If you have eternal torment to the minds of, human beings just trying to figure out life, right? You're like, but when you die, if you don't do this, you're going to be punished forever and ever and ever. I bet you get those. I bet you can get those people to do a lot of shit.
Right. Now, as you start moving now into the body, chapter, I think it's 8. I think the title is Puff Puff Pass. Like, is it okay to use cannabis, other mind-altering substances? This is a topic that was 100% off limits in evangelical youth group.
For sure.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
100%. Yeah. So, I mean, talk about the use of of substances from your perspective, from a Christian perspective. Sure. And your post-Christian concepts of it.
Sure. I think a lot of times I like to write like this because I want to get people to think. Like we use mind altering substances all the time. Like Christians are totally cool with it. We have coffee bars in our foyers now.
Right.
I had a pastor once brag about how many Vicodin his wife took after a surgery, and then condemned me because I used weed. And I was like, well, aside from the fact that I have an autoimmune disease that it actually helped. That's not a pastoral thing to say, and why? I mean, Vicodin is certainly an addictive substance. So what? Going back to sin, we talk in the Christian church about how all sins are equal, but like Animal Farm, some are a little more equal, right?
Right.
So we obviously condemn LGBTQ people because that sin is like the worst sin ever. Is anything non-heteronormative. And then we pick and choose which substances are cool and which are not. Like we'll sit there with our whole chest with food addiction, condemning people who smoke weed.
Right.
I think Jesus would say like something like, "Clean off your own porch."
Right.
There's a political aspect to it. I don't think a Christian should enforce their morality via the state. When they do, you end up with something like the drug war, which is racist.
Right.
It failed.
Racist.
Incredibly horrible. Right. So there's that aspect. Like if we are going to treat addictions, let's talk about addictions of whatever substance.
Right.
We need to treat it medicinally and therapeutically, not judiciously, not with the justice system. That's my view. And then there's the whole notion of like what's good for one person might not be good for another, might not be good for another.
Yeah.
The point is that what did Jesus say? It's not what enters the mouth, it's what comes out.
Right. So, you brought it up, the justice system. Chapter, I think 6, thou shalt not kill unless it's state sponsored.
Yeah, well, right.
The best chapter titles, by the way, props for that. So like, I mean, if you're going to touch all of the third rails, why not? Let's talk about capital punishment, right?
Yeah, why not? I honestly don't know how
it seems just completely inconsistent with the Bible, except when you look at the legal code in the Old Testament. But when you look at the New Testament, what Jesus is talking about, like when he in the Sermon on the Mount, he's like, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, so what do you do with that? Like, where does that even come from, do you think? The Christians supporting state-sponsored murder.
I mean, we've touched on it. It comes to the consolidation of power.
Right.
It comes with, it's. I'm at a loss sometimes, man. I'll be honest with you. Like I write these chapters, and I'm like, I haven't written anything no one else has written.
Right.
I'm a good writer, and I'm confident in that. But nothing like I don't know how you could be a Christian whose key figure was murdered by the state, and then turn around and support that. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. Like, your guy, pick a new mascot. Then pick a new guy.
Yeah,
pick a guy who wasn't killed by the state. Like, you want to support capital punishment. You want to erroneously throw out these facts that it actually does anything. There's really very thin evidence that it does anything.
Yeah,
it doesn't deter it doesn't even accomplish the goals it sets out to accomplish.
Yeah,
not to mention the racism, not to mention people being murdered, and then my God, they were innocent. Oh my God! Even the victim's family is saying, "You might want to stop this," and we go on with it in the name of the Christian nation.
Right. So what's the other way forward? Like, what do you feel like is the right path to be on? Right.
I mean, there's European countries that have restorative justice systems. They have what we call like bougie prison.
Prison.
Look them up in like Amsterdam. But they have the rate of recidivism is super low. People don't even go back to there. We need a justice system that is completely revamped. Like we have to hold people accountable with compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
We can't, like, our whole prison system is just an extension of slavery.
Right. No, for sure.
I mean, let's just keep it real.
It's also that the whole policing system is also just an extension of slavery.
That was going to be the next thing I was about to say. I mean, literally, historically.
Right. It's how
the first job of the cop is literally go round up black folks. Like that's, I mean, we've done revisionist history in this country pretty damn good.
For sure.
But maybe we should revise back to something a little more accurate.
Right. Okay, so your book, it's Heretic 2, right? Look at that. This is a brilliant cover. And where do people find this book?
Well, you can find it wherever you get fine books. Any bookstore should be able to order it. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Right. Yeah. The distribution should be wide and far, so you should be able to find it.
That's great. So, last question. You wrote this book. It's full of all of the heresies.
Well, not all of them. There's plenty.
Not all of
them.
I know it's an exaggeration. We're allowed to do that on social media, but but why write it? Why put it out there?
Why not? Well, I mean, writers write, thinkers think, like creators create. Like, I think like everyone, I think my ideas are good, but I think I have justification for they're well thought out. Like, I know I'm a good writer, and I know I have good ideas, and I think that people need to read more. And I when I started out as a writer, I was like, what more could I say that people haven't said?
Right.
And then you learn to not trust that imposter. That's imposter syndrome.
Right.
Don't trust that guy. He's not telling you the truth. And I think if everyone leaned more into their creative side and created things, we would have that's a part of our healing. Like, we would be more compassionate, empathetic human beings. Like, the more art we can create, whether it's books, podcasts, music, whatever, go create it.
Yeah.
And let people decide whether they like it or not. And they don't have to buy it.
Right.
I mean, people that want to burn my books, go burn them. Buy 20 first, though. and tag me on social media. Like, that's cool, man. Like,
yeah.
I'd rather you read them. That's what books are meant for. But, go burn them. But we need more of that. We need less book banning. We need more book reading.
Yeah. Matthew, thank you so much for taking time to hang out today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
So we have a church we call Not Church that is really full of all kinds of heretics and everyone in between. The name comes from a comment that somebody made that this place, it's like church. It's like all the stuff that you wanted from a church. People talking about spiritual things, people who are really there for each other, and no one is telling you you're going to hell because of what you believe. This group is all about finding the spiritual beliefs that work for us and being there for each other. If you're interested in being part of that Not Church community, you can go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. It's only $3 a month to get access to that. Patreon.com/skepticpastor. Also, if you are listening to this podcast and you can leave us a positive review, 5 stars, 4 stars, whatever the highest thing is on Apple or Spotify or Amazon or wherever, we would really appreciate it because those kind of reviews make a huge difference. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.